is a 2003 Mercury Marauder, and it's cool. This was intended to be a high-performance-y, sort of muscle car-y version of the Ford Crown Victoria and Mercury Grand Marquis large sedans, and I've always thought it looks awesome, and I've always wanted to review one, and today, I'm gonna. Before I get started, big news, this Marauder is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This car is in good shape and it's mostly unmodified, and it was a special car from this era, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this Marauder, where you can bid on it and buy it with no reserve, only on Cars and Bids. So let's talk Marauder. Like I said, this was supposed to be a more high-performance version of like the Ford Crown Vic, and it was only offered for 2 model years, 2003 and 2004. The Marauder certainly looked cooler than its Panther platform siblings, the Crown Vic, the Mercury Grand Marquis, and the Lincoln Town Car, and it also had more power. And there were other upgrades too, and today I'm going to show you everything. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the Marauder and show you all of its quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Marauder with a very brief overview of what this is. Like I said, it was the performance version of the Panther platform cars, namely the Ford Crown Victoria. That was an icon, a body-on-frame, full-size sedan, but it wasn't really known for its performance, and it was mainly known for its use as a fleet vehicle, as a police car, or as a taxi. This was the cool one. And there were a lot of ways that the Marauder was revised to make it cooler than a regular Crown Victoria or Grand Marquis, but undoubtedly the most important was the powertrain. Now, the Marauder used a 4.6-liter V8, just like the Crown Victoria and the Grand Marquis, but while those models had a single overhead cam version, this had a dual overhead cam. The result was way more power. Crown Vics made about 235 horsepower in this era. This had over 300 horses, which was a big improvement. And in fact, this powertrain, the one in the Marauder, was the exact same as the one used in the Ford Mustang Mach 1 at the time. It was a pretty serious performance car engine for 20 years ago. But it wasn't just extra engine power that made the Marauder stand out from a performance perspective. It also had upgraded brakes and suspension from the Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor, the cop car, and it also had a limited slip differential and an aluminum drive shaft. So there really were some upgrades to make this a more muscle car version than a regular Crown Vic. It wasn't just appearance modifications and cosmetic improvements. But there were a lot of cosmetic improvements to the Marauder also compared to the regular Crown Vic and the Grand Marquis, and you can see quite a few of them up front. Below the bumper, the air intake is larger to bring more air into this big V8, and you also had fog lights up here, which gave it a cool and sporty look. You also had a black painted grille as opposed to the elderly person special chrome grille that you would find on the Grand Marquis, and that helped to give it a sportier, performancier look up front too. And you had black headlights. Not really, but the parts that didn't need to be a certain color were painted black. So a lot of the insides of the headlights were black painted, again, in order to give it sort of a more aggressive, sportier, all black look up front. But speaking of blacked out things with this car, obviously this Marauder is black. And indeed, that was kind of the Marauder's color. It was the color in all the press pictures, all the advertisements were black, and when you think Mercury Marauder, you think black. It just goes together. However, all Marauder models weren't black, just the vast majority. Mercury sold about 11,000 Marauders total in 03 and 04, and roughly 8,300 of them were black. So again, the vast majority, but there were other colors. There was a silver Marauder that you could get. There was also a dark red Marauder, and there was apparently a dark blue, although that is the rarest color. I don't think I've ever personally seen one of those, but still to this day, when I think Marauder, I think black. And next up, around to the back, another notable quirky quirk of this car, something I've always found funny, is the taillights and reverse lights. On the Marauder, Mercury darkened them to the darkest legally allowable shade in order to kind of black them out from the factory. You can see they're not really blacked out, the reverse lights more than the brake lights, but that was their goal, to darken the rear lights in order to fit with the all-black theme of the rest of the car. And there were some other upgrades around back worth pointing out. One is this rear spoiler mounted on the trunk, probably not functional, but it did give it sort of a cool, sportier look. You also had Marauder printed into the bumper and painted. This was the only Marauder badge on the outside of the car, just this one here in the bumper. I always thought it looked kind of cool. And speaking of the bumper, right below it, you have dual exhaust. That was an option on the Crown Victoria and the Grand Marquis, but it looks cool on all performance cars, and it fits in with the other sporty upgrades to the Marauder. But probably my favorite Marauder exterior upgrade was the wheels. All Marauder models got these distinctive wheels that weren't offered on any other vehicles. They look kind of sporty with this thin 5-spoke design. All were chromed to sort of fit in with the muscle car American ethos, and they were 18-inch wheels, which were pretty large at the time. But the coolest part is the center cap, which is here. This is an old Mercury logo from the 1960s, not the modern logo they were using at the time, but an old one they stuck in the center of these wheels as sort of a throwback to their heyday when they were making cooler cars, to be totally honest. It's rare you see a throwback logo like that, and it's kind of an Easter egg if you know what you're looking for, to look in the center cap of a Marauder wheel and see that old school Mercury logo. But speaking of that old school Mercury logo, it also appears on a fantastic Marauder accessory that you could get with this car, and that would be this leather jacket, which you could buy to go along with your Mercury Marauder. Black, of course, to match the car. And I mentioned the logo because you can see it's on the zipper pull, that same old school Mercury logo, and it's also on the buttons, that same old school Mercury logo as a throwback to the heyday of Mercury. Also in this jacket, imprinted inside the collar, are the words "made exclusively for Mercury Marauder," which I think is just fantastic. Imagine buying one of these. You're an old guy in the American Midwest in the early 2000s, and you buy the jacket and you wear it to the nicest steakhouse in Lincoln, Nebraska, and you feel proud. Really though, this is kind of a cool, obscure Marauder accessory, and I bet no one will know what it is if you put it on. But anyway, next we move inside the Marauder, where there are quite a few interior changes to complement all the exterior and performance upgrades to this car, starting with the floor shifter. You can see it here. Still an automatic, but it was between the seats on the floor as opposed to in the column like most other Panther platform models. The Crown Vic, the Grand Marquis, and the Town Car, most of them had it in the column, but having it on the floor was sportier. Also sportier in here, unique to the Marauder, was the seats themselves. You can see embossed into the leather on the backrest is that old school Mercury logo on both front seats. You see it there again as kind of a cool throwback for a cool and special car. One thing the seats don't have, however, is any extra support. Even though this was a performance car, you can see still flat, cushy leather seats. They wouldn't really keep you in place if you were taking this to the track and going around hard corners, but I guess most people probably didn't care. Now, probably my favorite quirk in this interior is found in the gauge cluster, where you will see a tachometer, which is notable because this was the only Panther platform vehicle to have a tachometer. None of the other ones did. Crown Vics, Grand Marquis, they didn't have one, but the performance car, it made sense to add a tach. The problem was adding one took up the space where the battery voltmeter and the oil pressure gauge would have been. So in the Marauder, they had to relocate those, and they put them behind the shifter where they made them look kind of cool. And the intent here is they look like sporty performance cool gauges, even though really they're just relocated from the gauge cluster because of the tach, but they did find a way to make that more exciting for the performance model. Actually, to be totally honest, my favorite quirk in this interior is that the steering wheel has climate controls on it. You can see buttons here to adjust the temperature and the fan speed, which is a fantastic idea, and I don't know why modern cars don't have this. You have audio controls on your steering wheel and cruise controls and basically everything else, but climate controls seems like such a smart idea. It doesn't exist, except in some old school American cars like this one. But anyway, some other upgrades in this interior for the Marauder. One is the floor mats. As you can see, they say Marauder on them, so I guess that was an upgrade to an extent. You also had different gauges, in this case white face gauges, which is sort of a performance car touch, and they too say Marauder on them to emphasize the sportiness. And in this interior, you had aluminum look trim, which I guess is this. The press materials, I looked them up, they called this aluminum look, though I'm not sure exactly who thinks that looks like aluminum. It doesn't even come close. It is clearly kind of a cheap plastic, but it did replace wood trim that would have been in this version of the regular Grand Marquis, and obviously that didn't really fit in the performance Marauder, so instead you got this so-called aluminum look. And by the way, even though I joke about the aluminum look trim, that plus all these other changes worked. This car wasn't commercially successful for Mercury. They hoped to sell 18,000 a year over 2 years, and instead they sold 11,000 total, but it did bring down the average buyer age for this car. The average age of a Grand Marquis buyer at the time was over 70 years old, but the average age of a Marauder buyer was around 50, and so it brought younger people into showrooms to buy this car, even though they didn't sell as many as they thought they would. So these upgrades actually did have a benefit. But anyway, on to the other quirks in this interior beyond all the Marauder stuff. One is power adjustable pedals. This little button here, you press it and the pedals will automatically go forward or backward, which is nice for taller or shorter drivers sharing the same car. You also had automatic climate control in here, which was a nice feature expected on a car like this at the time. But one interesting thing, if you press this button, the outside temperature appears on the climate control screen instead of your climate temp. Apparently they didn't have space for two screens to show your climate temp and your outside temp, so you had to choose, but you could press it whenever you wanted to see the temperature outside. Next up, another interesting quirk in here, the seats. You can see in the front they have a little storage pouch. This extra leather pouch pops open and you can put stuff there if you want to. There's also a little switch next to that pouch, and that controlled the lumbar support for these seats. You press it for more or less lumbar, which was a nice luxury touch. But frankly, to me, the primary quirk slash feature you notice when you're sitting in this car is just how simple and basic it is. A lot of simply laid out, relatively cheap materials in here. Nothing is too complex or crazy, and that was the goal. The Crown Vic and the Grand Marquis, like I already said, were aimed at older people who wanted a traditional, full-size, body-on-frame car like they were used to driving in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And this was one of the last holdouts of that vehicle type in existence, and it really feels like an old school car in here aimed at some elderly, more traditional buyers. One fantastic example of that I love is on the overhead center console. If you open up this compartment, there's a slot for not one but two different types of glasses, because the old people who drove these cars wanted a place for their bifocals and also their prescription sunglasses. They just needed a spot for every type of glasses they might need to compensate for their poor vision. And so this car had that slot with the elderly buyers in mind. But anyway, next we move on to the back seat in the Marauder, and unquestionably the biggest quirk back here is that it just isn't really all that roomy, which was always true of these Crown Vic Grand Marquis cars. It never made any sense to anybody because it's a huge car with a big front seat and a big trunk, which I'll show you in a second, but the back seat just never had that much room, at least in the regular wheelbase configuration. It's just poor use of space and not great packaging back here. Obviously there is enough space, but it's not exactly huge like you might expect considering this is a huge car. Now, as for rear seat quirks, there really aren't any. It's just a leather bench seat, pretty standard. You do have these movable reading lights on the ceiling. They can be positioned normally, or you can sort of move them to angle toward one of the seats, but that's about it. Nothing especially quirky or interesting back here. But anyway, talking about use of space and that interior, next up let's move on to the trunk, which is absolutely massive. You can pop it open on the key fob, lift it up, and you can see an enormous amount of trunk space in this car. Absolutely huge. And I suspect Mercury and Ford knew that that's what their buyers wanted over rear seat space. The kind of older people buying these cars weren't often taking people in back, but they did want to throw in golf clubs or whatever and have a big sedan with a big trunk, and this certainly delivered. Now, one funny thing about this trunk, you can see the spare tire mounted on this shelf in the back of the trunk, and it sort of sticks out into the trunk. It's just not thoughtfully placed at all. This was actually pretty common in old school body-on-frame big sedans. They just stick the spare tire in spots like that. But obviously modern cars don't do this. Automakers are a lot more thoughtful about where the spare goes. But this car is a throwback to a different era of just about everything, and that includes spare tire placement. Now, one other thing worth pointing out in the trunk, if you look over on the left side, you will see this little slot is for your 6-disc CD changer, which was mounted in the trunk. Now, that wasn't actually all that unusual in the period. Even really nice high-end luxury cars sometimes had their CD changers mounted in the trunk. At the time, it was considered a luxury just to have a CD changer at all, as opposed to a single-disc CD slot inside. So this was a nice feature for its day. But before I drive this car, I want to talk a little bit generally about the Marauder, because my guess is if you're watching this, especially with the perspective of someone who's into modern muscled cars, you're probably thinking this isn't really all that much. And indeed, by modern standards, it doesn't seem like it is, but I can tell you back then, this was a huge deal. This car came out in '03. The Camaro had just been canceled. There was no Dodge Charger, there was no Dodge Challenger. Muscle cars seemed like they were kind of dead. Now, there were some high-performance American cars at the higher end. The Corvette and the Viper were still around, but it really seemed at that time like there might never be cheap American performance cars ever again. And back in that era, Ford gave us a little glimmer of hope with the 2003 Mustang Cobra, the Terminator Cobra, and with this car, that maybe muscle cars weren't dead just yet. And indeed, this doesn't have 700 horsepower like a Hellcat, and it's not some crazy supercharged Camaro ZL1, but it was a special car for the time and a little bit of proof, a glimmer of hope that maybe the muscle car wasn't dead. Of course, soon after this car, the Chrysler SRT brand started to come back and muscle cars thundered back to life. But for a while, it was hanging on by a Marauder-shaped thread. And so, those are the quirks and features of the Mercury Marauder. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Marauder. Now, a few things to say about this car before I talk about driving experience. One is, yes, this car did provide that glimmer of hope that the muscle car was still alive, but that didn't mean it was like an incredibly high performance and powerful car. 300 horsepower at the time was pretty good, and a big V8, that was nice to have, but this car also weighed over 4,000 pounds, and it used a 4-speed automatic like most cars did at the time, and so the performance and power was kind of dulled by the transmission and the size of this car. 0 to 60 was in the mid 7-second range, which really wasn't all that great. This was supposed to be like an answer or a follow-up to that mid-90s Impala SS that everybody loved, that was also black and sinister, but it just didn't quite have the performance credential to really do that. Ford kind of neutered this car just a little bit. They didn't want to give it a supercharged engine or a bigger engine. They just weren't sure people would buy it with more cost. And so as a result, it was just a little bit half-baked, even though it is a pretty cool, muscly car. So driving this car, first off, the owner told me when you floor it, you don't get a lot of low-end power. And indeed, that's kind of true. You got to get high up in the range, and then you actually do feel a lot of power, but it really only comes on above 4,000 RPM. Which is not ideal when you have a 4-speed automatic transmission doing the shifting for you, because it's not going to always stay in that rev range. With a 10-speed automatic, you can kind of use paddles, gear up, gear down. It can always kind of be shifting, but with a 4-speed, there's not that many gear choices for it to want to always stay high in the rev range. It's just not going to do that. Now, with that said, I am actually surprised at how quick this car does feel when you are high in the rev range. It's just sort of slow from a beginning, and I will say, as a result of that, I think this car would have been livened up with a manual transmission, because you could drop gears yourself and really get yourself into that lower gear and really get yourself going and have a little bit more fun. Now, I will say the car is a little bit more eager than I was expecting. Even though it isn't incredibly fast at low RPMs, Crown Victoria and Mercury Grand Marquis sort of have a hesitation to them. They have sort of a boaty feel. You step on the accelerator and things happen, but maybe not quite at much of a pace. This car does have sort of a feel where, especially at initial throttle tip-in, when you press it, it actually is a little bit more eager than I was expecting, especially given its size and the kind of boatiness that you associate with these big body-on-frame rear-wheel drive cars from this era. So let's talk about that boatiness for a second and the steering and handling in this car. It's fine, I would say. It's fine for what it is. Given the size of this car, it actually feels pretty spry and sporty, but it's not particularly spry and sporty when you're going around corners. In fact, I recently did a video like a year and a half ago about that Impala SS, and it seemed like it at least steered better than this car. Now, in terms of handling, I think this car has a little bit of an edge. That had even more of a boaty feel to it. This doesn't. It's not as big. It's obviously a little bit more modern, 7 years newer, but it still it does. I mean, this is not a throw it around corners performance car. So earlier I made fun of the seats for not being very supportive when you're on the track, but obviously that's not a feasible thing to do with this vehicle. It's not a track driving car, and it certainly doesn't feel like that when you're behind the wheel. Now, I'm here in LA reviewing this car, and I actually had it on Mulholland Drive, which is a notoriously windy, sort of hilly street, and it's not. I quickly realized it's not quite the place for this car, although it did surprise me more than I was expecting. Now, the owner of this car, he told me when he bought it, he did some work to it, especially some work to the suspension, not modifications, but sort of got it back to original new parts, and stuff that was worn, he replaced. And you can tell, I mean, the ride quality is not great, but it's fine, and the suspension certainly doesn't feel worn or saggy. It just feels, I mean, you're battling like a body-on-frame, large, heavy vehicle, and so you're never going to be able to neutralize that. Now, I will give this car credit for the fact that it is very roomy and nice in here. It's not as comfortable as I was expecting. You know, that's one of the things about these Panther platform cars, being body on frame. A lot of people at the time talked about, oh, they're so comfortable, you just sit in them, and really what they meant was they're roomy. Even the town car was never that comfortable, especially when you consider what luxury cars are capable of doing now with good suspension. At the time, it was like, well, they got a lot of suspension travel and sort of an old school design, so they're comfortable. It really wasn't. It's fine, but it's not like amazing or incredible. I love the look of this car. I think it's really cool. And they only made 11,000 of them, which is also special. I keep calling it a muscly car, and I think that's what it was. It wasn't really a muscle car, but it was muscly. It was more performancey than a standard Crown Vic, and I've always felt these were pretty cool. And so that's the Mercury Marauder. This isn't exactly a Hellcat in terms of performance, but it has some cool special touches like sinister sort of cop car styling and a big V8 and limited production. These are getting hard to find in decent shape, but you can find this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Marauder a DOUGSCORE. And the DOUGSCORE is here, 46 out of 100, which puts the Marauder here against some somewhat similar cars, directly behind the 1996 Chevy Impala SS. The Marauder was supposed to be a more modern take on the Impala SS, so that makes some sense, but the Impala just pulled it off better, with a cooler look and better performance relative to its era. Still, the Marauder is cool, and it did provide a nice ray of hope in a dark time for muscle cars, tiding us over until the Hemi-powered Charger came a few years later.